I decided to put together this presentation. Now, there's lots of room in this presentation, and I know you're all muted, so perhaps our discussions will have to wait till the end of it, and that's fine. But there is a lot of, I think, fodder for some discussion because I've left the door open on a couple of issues that you might want to pursue a little bit further. So let's just talk about what we're hoping to achieve here. I do like to give an outline ahead of what we speak about so that we can sort of follow along. But I'm going to start by getting into this whole idea of disturbance and what it means from the point of view of forest health and what really is a healthy forest. I want to talk about what forest insects do as disturbance agents. And, just to let you know that I think insects are perhaps the most fascinating group of animals on the planet. And if you want to actually be amazed by something that's happening in nature, typically insects will be at the root of it. So we'll get into some of that. I'm going to give you some examples just so we have a solid basis to think about what happens by way of disturbance and that caused by insects. And then we'll get into spruce budworm. And I think this is the point at which we can actually, having established a context, have a really decent sort of discussion around the spruce budworm. I'm going to show you a few of the observations that are suggestive of some changes. But before we get into any discussion of those changes, I need to give you some biology. So we'll have a basic budworm biology primer. And then we'll start looking at some of these recent changes and ask ourselves if the biology is helpful to explain these changes. And then we can wrap it up. Okay. So I want to start off with this image. I took this out of a helicopter when I was flying over a part of northeastern British Columbia back when the mountain pine beetle was doing its thing. And I like this photograph because it tells me a lot of things. When I look at this landscape, I can tell the past, going back perhaps centuries, even decades certainly. I can tell, in fact, even some of the future that this landscape might experience. And it's all about the way in which it's constructed. And if you look at this, you can see that it's a fairly diverse landscape. You can see all types of different forests that are on here. So the yellowish green forests would be a lodgepole pine. You can see, if I'll move my mouse here, you can sort of see this riparian area with some of the older hybrid spruce growing. And then we have these little tendrils of trembling aspen going down here. This is a pretty diverse landscape, and I think you'd all agree with me that this sort of is suggestive of a gut feeling of a healthy landscape. But what made this landscape? Because these are not static. Well, what made this landscape was disturbance. So a healthy forested landscape needs to be disturbed from time to time because they are not static. They need to be they need to experience change and rejuvenation. So we talk about this disturbance, and I'll have to define this term as any discrete event that disrupts forest ecosystem, community, or population structure and or function. A big mouthful, but effectively anything that really interrupts the way in which the trees are growing, either individually or as a group. Now, to make a landscape like this, things have to happen, and those things are typically going to occur by way of disturbance, and those disturbances are mainly in the form of fire or wind or landslides, or perhaps something that's caused by insects or diseases. And we, for convenience sake, refer to these as either abiotic, meaning they're non-biological in nature, or biotic in terms of the insects and diseases, given that they're actually biological agents. So what we're going to do then is focus on biotic disturbances. So how do insects manifest as disturbance agents? How do they cause disturbance? Well, they do that because they eat. So effectively, an insect causes disturbance by actually causing herbivory, which is the consumption of plant tissues. And you can see from this image here on the right, there's some really interesting sawfly larvae that are chewing on a eucalypt leaf. These guys are chewing away happily and actually causing some form of disturbance based upon our definition. But we can have disturbances of different types associated with different types of herbivory. And here we've got the European spruce beetle inside a Norway spruce log, feeding away on the phloem. So all types of tissues in any given plant, or in our case, trees that we're talking about, may experience some kind of herbivory. So this is true of roots, it's true of stems, of branches, of leaves, of needles, etc. All of those things are can experience some form of herbivory. Now, what happens though in the case of herbivory, and this is where we get to this disturbance point, is that there may be growth loss, there may be a deformation of the way in which the tree grows, or there could be whole-scale mortality of one or more trees. The direct impacts usually come about as tissue loss, or perhaps indirect impacts if you have, for example, a pathogen that's been transmitted by an insect. For convenience sake, we typically refer to insects that affect our forests as belonging to two different groups or guilds. And the guilds are effectively just a collection of types of organisms that sort of do the same kind of thing. So we're going to talk about two guilds going forward. The first are the bark beetles. And these are guys that feed on the stems of trees and frequently cause tree mortality. And then the others, and this is what we're going to focus on as we go forward, are the defoliators. And these are typically caterpillars that chew on the leaves or needles of trees. And their impacts are usually associated with the loss of growth of a tree. Now, just for complete transparency, to be complete, let's look at a couple examples of bark beetles. And as you can see here on the image on the right, they're really cute. It's hard not to look at one of these things and think that they're very much like a teddy bear. And I agree completely. I think bark beetles are wonderful. The nature of their feeding is effectively that they like old trees. So if you've got a big old tree, these guys are going to be happy. They feed beneath the bark on that thin layer of tissue that's above the sapwood but below the bark, known as the phloem. It's full of all kinds of nutritious things. They have very complex adaptations that they use to overwhelm the tree defenses because trees are not passive players in any interaction with an insect. They actually are capable of defending themselves. And in the case of tree defenses, this usually involves the production of all kinds of very toxic and nasty resin. But the bark beetles, of course, have evolved ways to get around that. And this involves the use of pheromones or the actual vectoring of mutualistic organisms, etc. The type of disturbance that these guys cause is usually tree death. And this is because for them to reproduce below the bark of the tree, this usually means the tree has to die. They have a very close association with pathogenic fungi. And several of these species are really prone to some big outbreaks. And these outbreaks themselves tend to be kicked off by a whole bunch of stress, perhaps following a drought event, for example. Now, there's two bark beetles in general that I want to talk about just to give you an idea of who these guys are by way of example. And the first is one I'm sure you've all heard about, the mountain pine beetle. This is an insect that causes the mortality of virtually any pine species in its range. And it's capable of causing some very significant impacts when outbreaks begin. And as you may know, this little guy, size of a grain of rice, has affected about 18 million hectares of our forests in British Columbia in the last couple of decades. And the impacts, like that image on the bottom there, are pretty extensive. We have lost nearly half of all of our mature pine to this insect, and the impacts have been beyond that in the sense that they've converted the forests of British Columbia from a carbon sink to a carbon source. So the impacts are pretty significant. But there's a closely related guy that you probably aren't familiar with, and the spruce beetle is one that has caused significant impacts in the far north in Alaska and adjacent areas of the Yukon. And in the 1990s, it caused mortality of trees over well over 2 million hectares. So there's more than just one bark beetle out there that can cause these impacts. But if we turn our attention to the defoliators, which is where we're going to focus from now on, there are a bunch of things happening here as well. So defoliators are typically those that prefer young foliage. And I'm going to talk a lot more about this idea of young foliage in a moment, but just take me at my word for the time being. Some of them will feed on the older stuff. Synchrony is a really big deal in the seasonal or temperate environments in which we live. So in other words, at the end of the winter, the synchrony between the emergence of the life stages, either the hatching of the eggs or the emergence of the larvae that have been spending the winter, and their access to this new foliage is absolutely key. If they can't be synchronized, they don't do very well at all. The nature of the disturbance that these guys cause is that they remove the photosynthetic machinery of the tree. And the image on the right is actually of a hemlock looper on a balsam fir twig. And you can see that this hemlock looper larva has done a fine job of removing all of the photosynthetic organs along that shoot, and that's not capable of actually photosynthesizing at all, and is a very unhappy tree as a consequence. So this typically leads to a general loss of tree vigor. It can lead to things like growth reduction or the deformation of the way in which the tree is growing. And here's just an idea of what you might expect by way of growth reduction. And interestingly enough, this is actually a piece of Douglas fir that was exposed to Western Spruce Budworm defoliation. And you can see that it would be growing annually based upon these rings and doing quite well until about 7 years of shorter ring widths here, narrower ring widths, which are a consequence of repeated defoliation for about 7 years on this particular poor tree. Occasionally, these guys are capable of causing part or all of the tree to die, especially if they cause lots and lots of impacts. And I'm sure you've seen some of that in Stanley Park recently. They also cause an increased risk of secondary agents like bark beetles. So a lot of times when trees are weakened by the defoliation of something like the Western spruce budworm, what follows is a bark beetle attack. And several of these are prone to very large outbreaks. Okay, let's look at a couple of examples of these. The first is the Western hemlock looper, and I did say a moment ago that you guys might be well familiar with this given the impacts it's caused at Stanley Park and across the inlet up in behind the Vancouver water supply. It likes Western hemlock trees. It can defoliate them very quickly and extensively, and actually, as a consequence, cause both growth loss and tree mortality. And of course, our poster child for today, the Western spruce budworm, this has a primary host of being usually Douglas fir, a couple of others, and it too is capable of causing growth loss and mortality. And this is the one that I want to focus on and give you a bit of insights to as to what's been going on recently. Now, part of what I've been doing so far is just trying to give you the sense that forest insects are natural parts of ecosystems. In fact, they're critical parts of a lot of ecosystems, and that they're very diverse. And even before we get, strictly speaking, talking about spruce budworm, I wanted to tell you that there's more than just one budworm out there. And this tells you here, just looking across at the boreal and the subboreal forest, that there's a whole bunch of different budworm species. So to the east, we have the eastern spruce budworm and jack pine budworm. At their high elevations out here in the west, we have a 2-year cycle budworm. Further to the north, we have a fir spruce budworm. And of course, the guy we're interested in mostly is here, the western spruce budworm. So the western spruce budworm is just one of a complex of budworms. And in fact, most forest types that we have in North America have a budworm associated with them. The guy that we're dealing with, of course, is prominent in our neck of the woods simply because it feeds on Douglas fir. Okay, so what's been going on with the western spruce budworm? Well, in recent years, we've had lots and lots of impacts. You can see here that most of the Douglas fir forests, which are indicated in green on this map, have been affected to some degree over recent years by some level of western spruce budworm impacts. And you can see too that in recent years, there have been pretty significant impacts, particularly in the central and northern parts of the Douglas fir range. If we look at how things have been changing through time, well, this is actually quite concerning because we see a couple of things here that are suggestive of something that's been changing. So if you look at the area affected through time, and interestingly enough, for the western spruce budworm, we have over 100 years of observations. Well, immediately it looks like things have been changing from the point of view of the extent, the severity, perhaps the duration of outbreaks. And if we look too at the way in which the distribution of outbreaks has been changing, you can see here if we look at how things were going between the 60s and 80s, and then perhaps the 80s and 90s, and then more recently, there's also the suggestion that maybe things are beginning to move around. So these are two really big questions that are dominating a lot of research lately. And the two questions I'm going to give you some answers for momentarily, but not until we get some biology. So here's where I want to talk about what the western spruce budworm does, and just speak to some of the biology that is relevant to these two questions that we want to deal with. So how does an insect, a tiny little insect, cause impacts to an individual tree? And when it really gets going, how does it cause changes that are actually functioning at a landscape scale, such as you see on the right in this photograph here? So the really big deal for the budworm, and I alluded to this right off the top, is it's all about timing. So let's look at the stylized life cycle of the budworm, and let's start with a moth here that's actually out and about, usually in and around the mid to late parts of July. And here, males and females will be mating, and the females will start to look for a place to lay her eggs, and she'll drop them on the foliage of suitable trees in and around the beginning of August. Now, those eggs are usually laid sort of in a shingle-like pattern along the needles. They're very tiny, very hard to see. And what happens is, in about 7 to 10 days after the eggs are laid, the larvae, the young larvae, will emerge. The eggs will hatch, and the tiny larvae will begin looking for a place to spend the winter. So I've used the term instar here, and it's a term that I'm going to define for you, but effectively, larvae of insects that actually have complete metamorphosis, they have a pupae and that transforms them to an adult. Larvae typically are just bags with mouths. Their entire job is to eat and eat as much as possible. But of course, they're an insect. And by definition, an insect has their skeleton on the outside, which means that they can only eat so much before they have to shed their skin. And so what happens is, in the case of the spruce budworm, we refer to the time between molting or shedding their skins as an instar. So now I'm going to refer to instars here, and the first one out of the egg is the first instar. Now that fella will be out in August, but rather than looking for a place to eat, it's actually looking for a place to spend the winter. So it will move out to the tip of a branch and it will spin a tiny little cocoon called a hibernaculum. And inside that cocoon, it immediately will molt to the second instar without even feeding. And then it hunkers down and waits out the entire winter until the next spring. And in the next spring, then it will emerge as a second instar. It will begin feeding and it'll develop through the third, the fourth, the fifth, and ultimately the sixth instar before pupation happens and we go back to the beginning. Now, there's a really critical constraint in this life cycle and one that is driving the entire outcome relative to those two questions I just posed you. And that is this need for synchrony. So essentially, if we don't have a condition whereby the young, tiny little second instar larvae coming out of their tiny cocoons in May, if that doesn't correspond to the initiation of bud burst, which is what you can see happening here, and here's our tiny little larvae just climbing into a new bud, that means this larva is done for if it's not actually appropriately timed. So this issue of synchrony is absolutely key to the success of this insect in our environments. So this is the basis of the constraint and the basis behind the whole idea of shifting outbreaks in terms of severity and distributions. And I'll show you how that works in a second. But this is not just the only constraint, because the other constraint is that this timing has to be perfect to begin with. It has to be tight because buds develop very, very quickly. So I'm going to show you a sequence of developmental pictures, which interestingly enough, I took off my back deck here in Victoria during COVID, which was a wonderful opportunity to start looking at things with a greater detail than I had before. But you can see that this bud cluster in May the 6th is actually beginning to swell, and you can see the patches of green through the bud cap here. Oops. This is ideal for a budworm to colonize because they're just opening up and the budworm is able to get in there and get established and actually begin to feed. 2 days later, things have begun to change. There's been a greater degree of expansion. Even further by May the 10th, so we're only 4 days in and already the needles have begun to flare out. By May the 12th, the shoots have been ripping right along, so we're only 6 days in and already we've got a dramatic change. By May the 18th, the shoots have already reached virtually their entire final length. And just 3 weeks after things started, May the 27th, the shoots have begun to lignify, and in doing so, they get harder. Their water content diminishes, the nutrient availability actually diminishes, and they're not that good for Western spruce budworm to feed on. So essentially, getting from the point of being this little guy here who has to find this, and then feeding to the point of being something of this size has to happen quickly. There's about 3 weeks in which it has to actually occur. Otherwise, again, the insects will starve. So just to give you some context, this guy here, our first instar larva, is perhaps 2, 3 millimeters long. And this guy here is the better part of 5 or 6 centimeters long. And so this is all accomplished by eating the tissues available to it while these shoots are elongating, but before they lignify or harden off. So let's bring ourselves back with that little basic bit of biology and ask these two questions with a bit more detail. And let's look at the first. Do we have a basis for this increasing outbreak severity in recent times? And I'm telling you, I mean, if you look at this, we've got mortalities or defoliation, sorry, of magnitudes of 800 or 900,000 hectares that were happening in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. So what's going on here? Well, we've got a situation which is rather unfortunate. And in fact, it's unfortunate only because of our manipulation of the forest. So we don't like fire, and we're really good at putting out fires. But there's a consequence to this. And by putting out fires, what we have managed to do is we have actually removed a normal, frequent but low intensity disturbance that occurs in a lot of these forests. And the removal of that has actually allowed the establishment of all kinds of younger trees that are capable of growing below the mature trees. This dense understory actually is a second source of food during an outbreak. So what happens is these, because they're in the shade, actually tend to have a bit of a delay in the timing of the bud burst that they provide for the western spruce budworm. And as a consequence, when populations are actually in the outbreak state, they will deplete the overstory. So here they've just finished with the foliage in this large tree. And rather than starving, they're able to drop down into the understory and have a second helping and complete their development. So this has actually increased a food supply, which has subsequently sustained a very large population, and it has done so all over the range of Douglas fir simply because we've been busy putting out low-intensity forest fires. So we've got outbreaks that are both larger and longer in duration as a consequence of our efforts at suppressing fires. But what about this outbreak range shift that I mentioned before? This, unfortunately, is a consequence of a warming environment. So we know that insects have a fairly simple developmental characteristic, and that is that we can map out their development by way of degree day accumulation. They're entirely dependent upon temperature. Everything they do is dictated by temperature. Trees like Douglas fir, however, have a slight nuance to that. They do require temperature to develop in the spring, but they also have a photoperiodic requirement. In other words, days need to be long enough before they actually decide to burst their buds. There's no sense putting out your photosynthetic machinery unless the days are long enough for you to actually be able to fix the photosynthetic material that you need to grow. So essentially, we have fairly sophisticated mathematical models of how these two things work. But they allow us to then examine whether or not synchrony can actually be attained if warming environments actually are manifesting themselves. So warming will affect the insect more than it'll affect the tree. And this leads to the possibility of asynchrony happening. This need for synchrony is actually beginning to be lost or even gained in certain environments. So I want to show you the results of some analysis that we've done. And here what we've done is we've taken these two models of insect and tree development, and we've used real weather data through time and asked whether or not there have been changes in this idea of synchrony. And so let me explain what's going to happen here. I've got these two graphs, one for the northernmost extreme area where budworm occurs and one from the southernmost area where budworm occurs. And this dotted line on both of these graphs tells you where it's ideal for the insect to be because they're actually synchronized with bud burst by the tree. And so if a point that I'm going to populate this graph with falls down here, it means the insect's too early. And if the point falls up here, it means it's too late. So we're looking for conditions that are closer to this zero line, which refers to optimal synchrony. So what we've done is we've actually used, as I said, real weather data to see what's been changing through time based upon weather stations. And in the extreme north, look what's happening here. We've got convergence towards optimal synchrony over the last century. But at the same time, it's been diverging in the south. So this co-occurrence of divergence and convergence has actually been leading towards a northern shift in outbreaks. And this is what's happening behind this observation of a northward shift. So populations in the south have actually diminished. And in fact, we had outbreaks by the western spruce budworm on southern Vancouver Island in 1910, but never since. And in the past, populations had never been in the extreme north of the distribution of Douglas fir, but now they're there and they're doing quite well. So this idea of both loss of synchrony to the south and the gain of synchrony to the north is actually shifting populations in their outbreak states further and further north. Okay, so can we predict anything out of the future? Well, as a professor, I am privileged to be able to work with some really smart young people. And these really smart young people have got an interest in things like machine learning, these sort of AI approaches to modeling our environments. And so working with them, what we've done is we've attempted to actually crystal ball what the future might look like for the western spruce budworm. And what we've done here is we've taken a moderate climate warming scenario, which is the SSP 370 from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Don't worry too much about that. But effectively, what we've asked is what would conditions be like towards the end of the century relative to what conditions are like at present? And then we've simply been able to map out where we anticipate range expansion, where we anticipate there's going to be no western spruce budworm outbreak populations, no change in range contraction. And so we've created what we call a dynamic outbreak distribution model, which is actually a product of ensemble modeling using machine learning algorithms. And if you guys want to talk about that when I'm finished, I'm happy to do my best to explain it. But essentially, what we've done is we've attempted to capture our understanding of the biology of both the Western spruce budworm and the Douglas fir tree, and then in doing so, predict where we might see things happening. And a couple of really interesting things actually manifest with this prediction moving forward. The first is that you can see here that through a large portion of the southern range of the Western spruce budworm in British Columbia, we expect it to contract, that it won't actually be there in outbreak populations in future. A large portion of the central parts of the province will remain. And then here to the extreme west or east, sorry, out here against the Western Rockies, in the northernmost extent of Douglas fir, and once again back here on the coast, we predict that we'll start to see outbreak populations of Western spruce budworm once again. Now, this is an interesting consequence of this shift in phenological synchrony or synchrony between bud burst and larval emergence. Okay, so that's our crystal ball. So what I want to do is just wrap this with a few conclusion statements and then happily open the floor to any discussions that we might want to have. And the first point I want to make is that disturbance is an essential ecosystem process. But the important thing to point out here is that this is critical that it's occurring within some sort of historic range of variability. And if it exceeds that, then we have some issues. Issues that might manifest in terms of reduced ecosystem resilience, perhaps tipping points into other types of ecosystems or regimes, and ultimately possible regime shifts. And a good example of this would be, for example, on the Kenai Peninsula of Alaska, where the spruce beetle, sorry, I'm getting spruces mixed up, the spruce beetle has caused such impacts that the spruce forests there have been converted to grasslands. That would be a tipping point and a regime shift in that regard. The second point I want to emphasize here is that these biotic disturbance agents are very sensitive to changing environments. So insects themselves are cold-blooded, they're ectotherms, and this means that everything that they do is affected by temperature. And this means that when temperatures change, so do the behaviors of populations of these animals. There's direct effects on insect development, but there's also indirect effects by the way in which the environment is affecting the tree. And I'll just offer a tangent because I'm a real nerd when it comes to fossils. And I came across a wonderful study that was conducted about a couple decades ago where a guy was able to actually excavate sediments in Wyoming and actually determine through these sediments a very precise estimation of changes through time where he could find fossilized birch leaves with evidence of insects feeding on them. And the time in which he was able to look through was actually corresponding to an ancient, well-known climate change event, something known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And he found that the types of insect feeding actually increased as the temperature increased and then decreased when the temperature returned back to normal. So in essence, what this says is that we don't have to recreate the wheel. We know that with a warming environment, we're going to have more insect impacts. That's just pretty much an axiom. So next, we have Western spruce budworm. This is just one of many native defoliators in North America and a critical and necessary component to most of our forested ecosystems. The budworm has worsened its impacts though recently because there's been a shift northward in the populations as a consequence of shifting synchrony between the insect and the tree, together with our forest management efforts through fire suppression that have actually increased the amount of food available to outbreaks. So they're shifting north and they're lasting longer because they've got more to eat. And finally, the future of the Western spruce budworm is suggestive of the fact that it's going to be moving into areas that haven't had it before and contracting from areas where it's been for a long period of time. And so this means that we're likely to see it back on the coast, out in the Western Rocky Mountains and the extreme northern distribution of Douglas fir to the north, up around Fort St. James, for example, coupled with things like retraction from areas in the southern interior where it has been historically. Okay. And with that, I'd like to say thanks for the attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions and have any sorts of discussion you might want to have.
So I've now allowed people to unmute themselves. There are a couple questions in the chat. Alan, let me just take a look here. So Jennifer asked, or no, Joan asked, is logging considered a disturbance?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, disturbance is not, it's not a natural disturbance, but it's certainly a disturbance. No, without question. Yes.
And then John, John, do you want to just ask your question, or would you like me to
Oh,
read it?
thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm not looking at the chat, but I guess disturbance. You covered natural disturbances, Alan, and I was just thinking about. I don't know whether I should say it unnatural disturbances or disturbances driven by mankind's activities, and there's a whole range of these things. It could be building roads, it could be logging, it could be building dams. There's all sorts of things we do, and I was
Mm.
just wondering whether it had any impact on the normal cycles of budworms. And are they doing better or worse? Is it been looked at in terms of the impact on their normal cycles, due to mankind's activities?
Yeah, a large part of my research focus in the last couple of decades has been this idea of disturbance synergies. So what makes things potentially worse? And as I mentioned, we have this idea that by putting out fires, which we do a lot of, and in many respects have to because we're protecting communities, but by the suppression of fires, we've actually improved conditions for budworm in terms of its food supply and made outbreaks worse. But there are multiple examples of these sorts of things happening all the time, where through our own efforts, whether we're actually causing disturbances ourselves or if we're affecting the way in which the systems work, we can actually exacerbate the problems. In the case of the mountain pine beetle, once again, fire suppression is at the heart of the size and extent of that outbreak, largely because we removed fire and left the forest intact to get uniformly old, which of course provided lots and lots of food for that particular insect. So I would be hard pressed not to find systems that haven't been messed up by our own inputs. The trick to managing these things, of course, is to do our best to establish, promote, or even reestablish resilience in our ecosystems, and that's usually driven by things that are around diversity. And that's why I showed that image right off the top. If you create a diverse landscape, you have a resilient landscape, and it's much better able to withstand these synergistic outcomes that we just discussed.
So Murray, I see your hand. I'm just going to go to one other point first, though. And Joe Hughes actually says what kind of controls are available for budworm. So,
Mm.
I mean, making the forest more resilient by increasing biodiversity. Do you want to give a couple examples of what that would be, how that what that would look like, Alan?
Well, diversity comes, in a bunch of different forms, and we usually refer to it as alpha, beta, and gamma diversity. It's usually, just for more simplistic terms, genetic diversity, species diversity, or structural diversity. And all of those things are actually at the basis of this comment on mine about this need for increasing diversity. Because it means that not all parts of a tree or all parts of a forest are susceptible to an insect at any given point in time. And if parts are, well, then those parts that are impacted are going to be essentially recolonized by the propagules, the seeds, or whatever else of adjacent areas that haven't been affected. So that's at the heart of the issue around diversity. In the case of the western spruce budworm, lots of old Douglas fir is going to give you lots of western spruce budworm. That's just the way it works. If you reduce these larger contiguous areas, then you can actually potentially by increasing the diversity, reduce the impacts of the western spruce budworm as an outcome. Um, it's not simply a matter of harvesting. Harvesting is used appropriately is actually an emulation of fire and actually can be a really useful way of improving diversity. But what we do post fire by way of reforestation is also going to promote this idea of diversity that can also lend itself to improving resistance and resilience to disturbance. Um, the question of actual control or management, we do have this idea of proactive or proactive control, management of a lot of our forest insects, which means modifying or manipulating our forested landscapes to the detriment of the insect themselves. And that's the way we all want to go. But unfortunately, most of what we do is reactive in nature. And in the case of the Western spruce budworm, our reactive approach to managing its populations usually involves the application of a bacterial insecticide. This bacterial insecticide is called BTK. It's a Bacillus thuringiensis. Um, it is applied by aircraft. It is ingested by the insects. The insects get sick and die. And this is actually done quite regularly. It was done over my house against the gypsy or the spongy moth, sorry, here in Victoria in the last year. And you guys probably see it going overhead last spring in and around your areas as well. Um, BTK is often misunderstood. It's a natural soil-borne bacterium. It is rather selective. It doesn't kill anything other than moths and butterflies. And when it's applied at an appropriate time and place, it's usually pretty selective in terms of the species of moth or butterfly that might die. I'm not a massive advocate of it, but I do understand that it has its uses in certain places, and I'm happy to talk about that if you guys like.
I'm gonna, Murray, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Actually, this is really interesting because about 40 years ago, my background as a biologist, both fisheries and wildlife. And about 40 years ago, one of the things I was doing is there was a spruce budworm outbreak, which I think it coincides with some of the time frames that you had on some of your graphs. This is up near Boston Bar, and at that point, there were a bunch of us were hired on, I guess, just for the summer, essentially to kind of monitor. So the object, I guess, was to actually use pesticide to try and wipe this thing out and control it. So our task, our role was to go in, and some of us were fisheries people, some of us were wildlife people, and they were basically experimenting with, pesticide control of the outbreaks, and then we were going to go in there and do both before and after studies of the fisheries and aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. So it's really kind of interesting. And then at some point, the whole thing crashed. So and so we didn't have to go. We lost our job. So, but it was so. This is interesting. I mean, you've answered some of these questions already. I guess it's just it's interesting to see. I think how I guess management of outbreaks has changed over time, and it sounds like it's become more ecological as opposed to just go in there and throw pesticide at something. And that was 40 years ago was when there were clear cuts were the norm, and things have changed.
I'm lucky enough to have lived as long as I have, but when I did start out, it was back in the day when they were putting organochlorine and organophosphate pesticides on the forests. It was horrific. And the nice thing that I can say is that in my field or my profession, we've learned and we've improved. And to date, the only products that are actually registered for use in natural forests across the entire country is BTK. That's it. So as much as people complain against it, I see it as a tremendous win given where we were only 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Harvey, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, this relates to the modeling that you were talking about. So you were doing these models, and they are forecasting insect populations based on synchrony, more or less. But of course, there are a lot of other factors that are going to impact how the trees are doing. The availability of water is going to shift as we have warming climate, and there will be other factors that will change probably the distribution of trees. Did you consider any of that in your modeling? And if so, do you have any thought, like, do they amplify the effects of the synchrony for the insects, or do they damp things down? How did that work out?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I honestly didn't go into detail there because I thought it would be a little bit boring had I gone too deep into that modeling effort. And if you like, I can send you the link to the paper we published on it. But our ensemble models were actually built where the synchrony variable was just one of many that were included in there, because all of the other aspects around climatic conditions, environmental conditions, the age, distribution, and condition of the host trees, all of those went in the model. And in the end, using the approaches that we did, we were able to determine which of those that were important in the model, how they influenced the prediction of the model, and ultimately provided these outcomes. We did validate the model, and we actually were capable of predicting outbreaks with 94% accuracy, which honestly nearly floored me, because this is not something that you normally can do, and this is one of the things that machine learning is sort of opening the doors for. I'm a firm grump when it comes to things like Chat GPT and so on and so forth. But every once in a while, you wind up with these sort of machine learning applications of algorithms that are dealing with real biology, and I go, huh, it just makes me scratch my chin and think maybe we're onto something once in a while. But no, so just so you know, Harvey, we did include many of the things that you brought up, and interestingly enough, the synchrony variable still remained the most important in the model, which was fascinating, even after we included things like the age and structure of the forests, the climatic conditions at the time of the prediction, which would have been things like precipitation deviations and drought and so on and so forth. Synchrony still was the most important part of it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harvey. Lisa, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, I actually have a lot of questions, but I'm just gonna choose one or two of them. Um, so I don't know if you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that Western spruce budworms actually feed on spruce. How do they end up on Douglas fir then?
I'm sorry. Thanks for the question. I laugh simply because this is I've been teaching this third year entomology course at UBC for 16 years or so. In fact, I taught Laura's son. And every single year, there's a massive grump or complaint on the part of the students where I force them to learn the Latin names of the insects. And the example that I use is Western spruce budworm that feeds on Douglas fir. So if you want to talk to me about Corystanura occidentalis, I'm all over that, because that's the Latin name of the insect and there's no confusion about what it feeds on. But there's lots of common names that unfortunately are not all that informative and sometimes very confusing.
I see. And I wonder if I should take this to give this opportunity to other people, or Laura, do you think I should keep on asking?
You can ask another question, Lisa. It's okay.
Okay, so my next question is, you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that beetles prefer old trees while like worms prefer younger trees. I wonder, why is that?
Okay. So the difference there is in the case of the bark beetles, they like the old trees because just like us, when you start to get older, you get a little bit slower and a little bit less resistant to your environment. And that's what bark beetles like, because they're the ones that are boring through the bark of trees and occupying the tissues below the bark. And if the trees are super healthy and able to sort of resist themselves, they'll do it and the beetles will lose. So the preference there on the part of the beetles is for old trees. Now, in the case of things like the Western spruce budworm or hemlock looper or whatever else we're talking about, it's not the young trees they like, it's actually the young foliage. So it's worthwhile thinking about this for a moment, because we don't really pay attention to this. But if you look around yourself during the first week of May, if you walk around through Stanley Park or out in the woods someplace, and you look closely, you'll notice that the tips of the branches are producing this soft green foliage. And that soft green stuff is the best stuff if you're going to eat it. In fact, you can even yourself take a bite out of it, because you can chew on it, you can swallow it. It's not gritty, it's not sappy. It's perfect for things to eat. And that's what the things like budworms and loopers and whatnot, that's what they want to eat. And that's why this issue of synchrony is so important, because that stuff is only out in the environment for a short period of time.
Not that they prefer old trees, young trees.
I see. So it's more like how those insects are feeding that are influencing, because when you are, for example, like a beetle boring inside the tree, it's more likely for the tree to use chemicals and all those like nasty things that could more likely kill beetles, if that's why they would choose old and weaker trees. Well, the worms that are like above, they're on the branches, they're not burrow in, so it's harder for the trees to attack, and they still could get better food in this occasion. Is that kind of what
That
I'm
works.
getting at?
That works, yeah.
Thank you.
John, you have
okay.
another question in the chat. Do you want to say your question about the defoliation patterns?
Yes, thank you. Yes, Alan, I was listening to the part on defoliation and I sort of drifted off a little bit because out in the field as an amateur citizen scientist, I take photographs of life, but also of evidence of life. And one of those things are bite patterns on leaves. Leaf miner being, a typical example. And then we feed them into online platforms like iNaturalist and others. I'm wondering if there's any useful information that we could focus on to help with identification based on bite patterns for the budworms or even other insects for that matter. It'd be great to find out because a lot of times we don't see the actual living thing; we just see the evidence. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do, and in fact, it comes back to the sort of the tangent that I tripped out on with regards to the fossilized leaves. So the fellow that was doing this is from Penn State University. Peter Wilf is his name, and he has essentially developed a guide to insects and insect damage that began with his assessments of these fossilized leaves, because he was doing exactly what you were doing, but he was doing it with leaves that were 56 million years old. And he actually I invited him to UBC and we had a great interaction and he spoke to my students. But one of the things he showed us, and I think he's published this, I'd have to dig around to be sure, but he showed us a guide that he's developed for people like yourself. And in this case, it was for people working in the tropics who were encountering leaves that had been chewed on without any evidence of who did the chewing. And he was able to use his sort of damaged types, and he had about 37 different kinds to actually narrow down the culprits.
I would really greatly appreciate if I could get my hands on that or that if it's possible.
I will. I'll get Laura to remind me, and I'll see what I can do to dig it up for you and send it out. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I see that Denis, Teresa, and Teresa have a question about specifically Manning Park. Do you guys want to unmute yourself and ask?
Oh, well, the question is that I think most Vancouverites, we tend to think of Manning as being sort of the western edge of the southern interior, but my understanding is that Manning doesn't have a past history of western spruce budworm infestations. So I'm wondering, you were saying you expected it to kind of decrease in the interior, the frequency of infestations, and increase on the coast. What do you expect to happen in Manning? Do you think it will have this one bad infestation and then improve, or do you think it will be like the coastal system and it'll keep having more infestations?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I suspect that the reason why you're seeing it in Manning, and I don't think I actually was clear enough on this because I was talking about northward shifts, but really that's both north and up in elevation. And Manning is reasonably high elevation, which is probably why it was doing what it was doing when you saw it there. The future of these sorts of things is really a product of essentially the amount of food that can support a population. And in Manning, I'm trying to think now what to the conditions of those forests. It's been a while since I've been in there, but I suspect they're probably very typical of most of these types of forests across the southern interior, and probably will sustain 4 or 5 years of defoliation, perhaps not quite at the levels we saw this last year, but I suspect they'll be high for some years to come. Will we see much in the way of mortality? That's not really the way that western spruce budworm works. It might cause the death of the tops of some trees that are really significantly defoliated, but typically the trees will survive and despite a bit of growth loss, will ultimately sort of recover.
So they
Okay.
don't have as severe an effect as the hemlock looper moth.
No, so that the hemlock looper is a kind of a slightly different beastie. It does like new foliage. It feeds primarily on new foliage, but then when it gets to be a bit older, it feeds on the older stuff too. And so it actually has a bit of a more varied diet. And the consequence of it is that it actually can strip an entire tree in 2 or 3 years. And once the tree is entirely stripped, it's usually going to die.
Sorry, Teresa, I might have interrupted you. Did you want to add anything more?
No, I have another question, but only after you've gone through the other ones in the chat. There's a couple more one more in the chat, I think, from Murray.
Yeah, from Murray. Did you want to, Murray, would you like to? Where are you?
I'm here, just a sec. Yeah, so another question. So I was thinking about Manning. I also worked as a park naturalist in Manning, so I know it reasonably well. And since I've been there, working there, of course, they had the pine beetle outbreak that included Manning Park. So my question, I guess, was that how could the relatively recent pine beetle outbreak in Manning, how could that affect future potential spruce budworm outbreaks?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, not specifically being familiar with the state of the forest in Manning, because I haven't really been walking around in there in a while. I'll just give a more generic answer. But here it is. Lodgepole pine, which is the species that the mountain pine beetle has so affected over much of British Columbia, is a species of tree that normally, without fire to intervene, is replaced by other shade-tolerant species. It's not the climax species in most environments. And so, in the absence of fire to replace the lodgepole pine, usually when mountain pine beetle kills it, the trees will be replaced by the slower growing shade tolerant species like Douglas fir, like spruce, and so on. And so in many of these areas that aren't likely to burn, that do have a component of these other species, what we'll see eventually is that the forest will just replace themselves, but not with lodgepole pine. And so in many respects, the beetle has done us a favor by injecting a bit of diversity back into these ecosystems, provided, of course, the big fire doesn't reset it all and lodgepole pine begins again.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, because of course Manning is kind of on the cusp of the interior versus the coastal ecosystems as well. So you've got this real mix to begin with of forest species.
Yeah. And that makes it pretty resilient in most respects, yeah.
Somebody had asked how you spell the scientific name of the western spruce budworm. And then there's an answer there in the chat.
Do you want to see if I can do it off the top of my head?
Chloristonura occidentalis.
Yeah. Choristeunera.
Oh, that's
Occidentalis.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I get a gold star.
I thought there was the same name for that scientific name. I actually looked on Wikipedia and I think they had like a pretty similar name. It's like Freemanni.
Yes. So it was up until about 10 years ago, Choristeunura freemanni, and they changed it to occidentalis.
There. Okay.
Okay.
So now, Teresa, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, this is, I guess, it sort of relates to Murray's question, but here in the lower mainland, particularly the North Shore Mountains and Stanley Park, we've lost a lot of trees, a lot of the hemlocks to the looper moth, and we're losing a lot of our Doug firs to summer drought. And I'm wondering if what you're saying, which is that basically, based on your modeling, we're in line to be seeing increase in the spruce budworm, if it's going to be increasing on the coast and is kind of moving north. I'm wondering what the sort of significant hit for kind of three key species that make up most of the conifers, certainly on the North Shore Mountains, which do tend to be a fairly diverse ecosystem with a mix of mostly those three trees. what's likely to happen if we got a real hit of the spruce budworm? Is it, since it doesn't kill the trees, that would it still be okay, or are we going to kind of end up with a situation where our conifer forests end up converting to be a more mixed conifer and deciduous?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that a complete answer would take a long time. But I'll just throw a few things out and see where we go with it. If you want more details, that's fine. Um, our coastal conifers are sort of in the midst of change. There's no question about it. The increasing sorts of summer droughts are not good for Western red cedar, which makes me very sad. It's my favorite tree. Um, It's less impactful on Douglas fir. And in fact, I've done some work with the Victoria, the water supply, the Capital Regional District water supply, who have done some detailed, long, deep time assessments of pollen, so a palynology study. And what they found is in the past, in drier times, their land base would actually move more towards Douglas fir. And in wetter times, it would actually go a little bit more towards Western red cedar and hemlock. So if we kind of take that as maybe a little bit of a sort of a compass arrow as to where things are going, then perhaps Douglas fir is going to be okay on the coast. Granted, it's prone to being defoliated by Western spruce budworm. But as I said before, I don't think it's going to be the kind of situation where extensive mortality is caused. So we might see a decline in certainly Western red cedar, to a lesser degree, maybe Western hemlock. But here again, the hemlock looper is a natural and native insect that causes impacts periodically. Hemlock is a prolific cedar and happily grows in shaded conditions, and will replace itself very quickly. It's not a problem. It's sort of its silvix is one where it's actually very resilient to this type of disturbance. So I think the wetter areas, probably some hemlock, probably lots of Douglas fir. Our poor old Western red cedar is probably not going to be around too much, except in some very specific areas.
So here's an interesting question from Peter. Are the second instar that hibernate over winter ever affected by severe cold weather?
Oh yeah, what a great question. So insects are fantastically complex animals. And I said right off the top that if you ever want to find something weird or wonderful in nature, an insect is probably doing it. Now, in the case of insects like the Western spruce budworm and many other insects for that matter, they are really well adapted to cold. So what they do is they will, before winter sets in, they'll get rid of everything in their guts and they'll physiologically flood their tissues with antifreeze, glycerol effectively. And after they've flooded their tissues with antifreeze, they're pretty much capable of taking temperatures down around minus 40 degrees. So is overwintering mortality a problem? It can be, but it's got to get really, really cold for them to actually die in that condition because they're so well adapted to dealing with cold.
So it sounds like they're better adapted than mountain pine beetle.
Well, mountain pine beetle in the right stage will take minus 38 before it suffers mortality. Yeah. So the problem with mountain pine beetle is that it has to reach that appropriate developmental stage that is most able to withstand cold, and if temperatures are such that it can't do that, then it will suffer a lot of mortality. Or if cold happens to occur after it's metabolized all of its antifreeze, then it will suffer a lot of mortality again. And for those of you who are familiar with the previous mountain pine beetle outbreak that collapsed in the 1980s over much of the Chilcotin Plateau, that's because they actually had minus 40 degrees, minus 35, minus 40 degrees around Halloween for 2 successive years in a row, 85 and 86, or 84 and 85. And actually, that was actually the end of that particular outbreak.
Marie, I'll come to you in a second. I just saw that there was Wendy made a comment, but wouldn't the freezing weather affect the synchronicity with bud development?
Well, so here's the thing. The cold is experienced by both the tree and the bug. And so they're both basically in lockstep through the cold periods. And when things warm again in the spring, then the insects will be accumulating their temperature and developing accordingly, and the tree will do the same, but it'll wait for the right photoperiod before it bursts its buds.
And I
And so-
don't think I don't think bud set happens and then it's fine over the winter whether it's cold or not. It's the springtime that when it starts to come out.
Yes, and that's an aspect I didn't touch on, but the idea that you can have springtime frost events that are really nasty to the tree and the insect as well, because if a frost occurs after buds burst, those sensitive, undifferentiated tissues that are coming out of those buds, if they freeze, they're done. And if the insects are in there, they're going to suffer mortality as well. So the variability in the climate is something that can be really, really significant in terms of mortality.
Now, Murray,
is
would
it
you
like-
like to go
Sorry.
ahead? Oh, sorry, Lisa, just one sec. Murray, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, it actually wasn't a question. It's just I was interested in whether or not there was some good. This doesn't have to be answered now. Any good, I guess, overviews of spruce budworm biology, modeling, et cetera, in the context of forest ecology and management, that type of thing. Again, it doesn't have to be answered now, but it's just something I want to draw attention to.
Yeah, an overview. Yeah, interesting. I'll give that some thought.
Great, thanks.
Lisa, did you want to say something?
Oh, it was just a comment during like the conversation. I think when in the north when global warming happens, I think it's the temperature that's actually letting the budworms appear more earlier than the photo period of the trees. So that's why there's more time for the budworms to feast on buds.
Yeah. Basically, what's happening is the trees being sort of entrained by photoperiod, even though temperatures are warming, they're still going to burst their buds at the same time. Historically, in those northern areas, it was too cold for the budworms to actually to emerge at the appropriate time. But now it's actually, with warming, becoming better and better for them, which is where the synchrony is improved.
I see. But in the south, how does that not improve? And
Well, it's because it gets so warm that the insects come out way too early, because the trees are still waiting. Even though it's nice and warm, the trees have no need of producing their new foliage to photosynthesize if the days are very short. So but the insects don't wait. They can't.
I see. So the photo period is not changing. It's just the temperature. I see.
Exactly. I think if the photoperiod began to change with climate change, we'd have a real problem.
I see a hand up at Denis and Teresa.
This is again just a more specific question about the period in Manning. Looking at your lifestyle kind of chart that showed that basically in July it was the adult moths. Basically, most of the feeding would have already finished by then. We were up in Manning in June, and there was, no sign of any kind of damage at all. Although from your chart, it looked like sort of starting in May, there would have been pretty kind of voracious feeding. But we kind of nothing was kind of really noticeable. Admittedly, we weren't looking close up because we weren't aware of it. And there was still sort of some snow on the ground and stuff in June, but by a few weeks later in July, there was this really dramatic, browning of the forest. Is the kind of delay into June for the start because of the higher elevation at Manning?
No, it's actually not a delay. It's just a simple function of mechanics. And I mentioned this to John when we were just getting started. The tiny little larvae, even though they can be highly abundant, they're so small that when they're feeding, you just can't see their impacts. But they grow so fast that by the time June rolls around, that little 2 millimeter long larva is now 5 centimeters long. So they just eat so much more at that size that their impacts become very suddenly apparent, even though the numbers haven't changed at all through that short period of time. They've just grown so much that they're able to eat all kinds of foliage.
So sort of the impacts on May of the larvae in May weren't really apparent in early June, but by kind of even 2 weeks later, those larvae are so much bigger that there's like a real
Yes.
increase in how visible the damage and how visible the damage would be.
That's exactly right. Yes.
I would say that Manning is probably a little bit later than May, just because what would typically be spring happens later because of the elevation, right? So we did start seeing the little caterpillars, I would say probably mid to late June. But they were, as you say, they were so small we couldn't tell what they were, but they were there. They're probably coming out maybe mid-June. So I would say maybe a little delayed from the May thing just because of the elevation.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right, Joe. You're exactly right. One thing to, if you're ever out and you want to see what's going on, usually what happens is the young larvae get in underneath those bud caps and they will produce some webbing, silk, like a spider does, but they do it out of their mouth parts. And they try and web the needles and the bud cap all together to create a little bit of shelter for them to develop in. So when they're small, you can usually see evidence of these little shelters they create. And then when they get bigger, they start making a great mess of things. And that's usually when we start to see them. But, if you do know what to look for, they're not that hard to find when they're tiny.
Hey, well, I'm going to say that we should let you go. You've been talking now for many hours, Allan. Thank you so much. I think people found this really fascinating. I hope that some of the people that were at camp came. So that's great. Yeah, so it was great to have you, Allan. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And, Laura, remind me, I think I'll find that paper that Murray was looking for and perhaps the description of feeding types for John, and I'll send them out to you guys.
Yeah, I've got a couple. I've made a note of them, so I will bug you if I don't hear from you, Allan. Okay, everyone. Well, good night. Thanks for coming, everyone.